Ja, ganz vielen Dank für die Einladung. Ich würde sagen, ich gebe den Vortrag auf Englisch. Allerdings, wenn Sie Fragen auf Deutsch stellen möchten, geht das auch. Ich kann damit auch umgehen. All right. So, I want to start here with this report. This was published in the feedback papers in 1971. But it's a reprint of a report that was made in a technical journal with the wonderful title, Analyses and Prognoses on the World of Tomorrow, Information Service on Questions of the Future for Management Personnel. If you can't read the German, this is a report of a project to install a phone-in system at Westdeutscher Rundfunk, the German radio station in Cologne. And the idea was that they wanted to provide their listening public with the ability to respond to questions that were being brought up in the course of the broadcast itself, not just in the studio audience, but in the entire broadcast area. And this might seem fairly commonplace to us now, but at the time this was seen as, on the one hand, a possibly revolutionary way to address questions of institutional legitimacy. Not only radio stations, but all the way up to the level of national governments in this time period were dealing with problems of responsiveness to the public. And this was seen as a possible way to provide the public with a way of giving direct feedback to how those institutions worked. As they report here, though, they couldn't really build a real representational picture of public opinion. As we know, public polling has a lot of sensitivity to how the questions might be worded. And as they describe here, the language only worked in one direction. The information that came back from the public when they phoned in their opinions was only in the form of normalized numerical values, which didn't really work as a means to get a real sense of what the public was thinking about the topics of the broadcast. It was over questions, things like whether young men should be required to cut their hair, whether women should be allowed to have jobs outside the home, the kind of questions that were pressing concerns for radio programs in the late 1960s. I bring this up because I want to use this as an example of how pervasive the thinking about cybernetic systems and information theory were in this time period. This was seen as a sort of path to the future of building a real direct democracy, as they describe it here, as a sort of technologically enabled utopia. I want to claim in the presentation I'm going to give here that these ideas about cybernetics and information theory were so pervasive and so all-encompassing to such an extent that they are not only a historical context that helps us understand how not only government agencies or institutions like radio stations operated, but they were also very much on the minds of the artists of the time period. I'm going to be talking about a couple composers. One of them is Anestis Logothetis. These are a couple scores of his. Anastasis on the left, Karma Dharma Drama, which is a set of 7 different music theater pieces on the right, and Roman Habenstock-Hamati. These are both, as you can see, these are both scores that are derived from the same set of copper plates. You can see some visual similarities between the two. On the left is his piece Décision, which is a bound score in black and white. On the right is Constellationen, which is a set of unbound full-color sheets. These kinds of scores are part of a larger category that I'm going to describe as musical graphics. I'm going to distinguish here between musical graphics as the broader category and what I'm going to be describing as ergodic scores. These are 2 scores that were presented at an exhibition in Donaueschingen in 1959. It was curated by Habenstock-Hamati. The original title for that presentation was New Ways in the Representation of Serial Music. Habenstock-Hamati was the editor for notational standards at Universal Edition in Vienna, and he was very much concerned with how scores look. And this was part of his effort to show how serial music had developed to such a point that it was no longer possible to represent it with conventional notation. You can also see here from these two examples, this is Stockhausen's Studie 2 on the left, Haben-Stockhamadi's study for Decision that he was working on all the way back in the 1950s, that there is also a really strong influence from electronic music. Stockhausen's score very much resembles a sonogram, and you can see in Haben-Stockhamadi's study that he has a very strong influence from Musik konkret, the ideas of taking found materials and manipulating them, splitting them apart, shrinking them, expanding them. What I want to distinguish here, though, is that with these scores that I'm going to be describing as musical graphics, you can still read them as if they were a notation. You could still follow them from left to right, and if you have an audio recording of a performance, you could still more or less tell what you were hearing is a performance of what you were looking at in the score. This is from Nelson Goodman's definition of a notation, the idea that we are dealing with a notation when it's a symbolic system where it's at least theoretically possible to identify the performance as a performance of a given score, that there still exists that relationship. What I want to describe is the kind of graphic scores where that isn't possible, where if you have the score in front of you and you are listening to an audio recording, you can't really tell that it's a performance of the score you have. And that gives us as composers and musicologists a bit of a dilemma. We normally think in music that the meaning of a piece of music is conveyed through its sound. But if there's no real linkage between the visual material of the score and the sound that results, that chain of communication breaks down. And so the problem I'm trying to solve is how scores that don't work as notations in the way Nelson Goodman describes them still work to convey a sense of meaning. So what I wanted to take as an example, and what I'm going to walk you through a little bit, is how this problem was addressed in literature. This is a book that was published by Espen Aarseth in the early 1990s called Cybertext. If you can't read the subtitle, it's Perspectives on Ergodic Literature. The term as he uses it, ergodic, is a neologism in literary theory. The Greek root ergon means something like work or labor or effort. Hodos means like path. So the path through the text that requires effort. And what he was addressing were computer games, very early rudimentary computer games. This is a text-based computer game from the early 1980s called Adventure. It was the first of a whole class of games that were called adventure games. They're basically a programmed version of a tabletop role-playing game. The text here is describing a scene. You're in a clearing. There's a few features around, rivers, there's a cave. You can type in commands, and then the computer program will do things. What Aarseth was trying to address was that these kinds of games work like a form of literature. You have a text that you read. There's a certain narrative arc. It has a beginning, a middle, and end. But in a lot of ways, they don't work like conventional literature, like a novel that you would read in a book, right? For one, the text that you're reading, a good portion of it is written by the player, by the user. For another, the reading can be different every time you go through it, depending on what decisions you make in the course of reading, depending on processes that might exist in the game itself. And this creates a problem for textual criticism, for how to understand this as a form of narrative literature. I want to make clear, though, that when I'm talking about cybernetic literature or cybertexts, the way Aarseth describes them, I'm not talking about technologically mediated texts. He describes that as a sort of historically deterministic techno-fetishism. There are cybertexts that are printed, physical books. This is an example from Raymond Queneau, 100 000 milliards de poèmes, is also a form of a cybertext. It's very simple. It's a really good example of how these kinds of texts can thwart a lot of our expectations about how a text works. It's 10 pages. On each page is a 14-line sonnet. Each of the pages is cut in such a way that you can turn each line of that sonnet individually, giving you 10 to the 14th different possible combinations of poem, hence the title 100,000 billion poems. For a literary critic, that's a real problem because you will never reach a point where you've mastered the entire text. We could all flip those pages for 1,000,000 years and never read every possible poem that's in this little book. One of them might be the very best poem you've ever heard. It might be the greatest poem ever written, originally in French or later in the English language. but none of us really have any way to say that that is or is not the case. We'll never get there. So the idea of a cybertext, he's deriving the idea of cybernetic from the original Greek word for a ship's steersman. We get through Latin corruption, we get the word governor from the same root. It is medium agnostic. And it describes systems in which, as he says, if you can read the English, I will allow you to do that. If you're more comfortable with the German, I will read you the German translation. Das Konzept des Cybertextes konzentriert sich auf die mechanische Organisation des Textes, indem es die Feinheiten des Mediums als integralen Bestandteil des literarischen Austauschs darstellt. Es lenkt die Aufmerksamkeit jedoch auch auf den Konsumenten oder Nutzer des Textes als eine stärker integrierte Figur, als es selbst die Rezeptionstheoretiker behaupten würden. Während des cybertextuellen Prozesses hat der Benutzer eine semiotische Sequenz vollzogen. Und diese selektive Bewegung ist eine Arbeit der physischen Konstruktion, die die verschiedenen Konzepte des Lesens nicht berücksichtigen. There are two key points that he's making here that I think are really important in describing cybertexts. First is the idea that we are talking about the text as it is mechanically organized. We're talking about the physical text and how you put it together. And second, the fact that the user of these texts is also a central figure in this process. We are not passive observers. We are not a passive reader that is then constructing the meaning ourselves. We are actively involved in creating the physical text that we end up reading to get the meaning. I wanted to take these concepts and I wanted to transfer them over and see how they might work as a model for understanding graphic scores. And so there are some general features of cybertext that I want to describe, and then describe how we might build out of that an analytical apparatus. Some key points about these kinds of texts: that they are transient. As I said, every realization and every experience of that realization is going to be unique. It is a non-reproducible experience. Part of that non-reproducibility is due to the fact that we as participants are going to be actively involved in making decisions, and that those decisions have consequences. So you might choose to go one way through a particular text, and that will affect what kind of text you read later on. That will affect how you are going to proceed through the narrative. And as a consequence of that, we have an experience that I think is essential to the idea of a cybertext, that there is this experience of aporia, that some parts of the text might not be accessible to you just because of the way the text is designed. With, for example, some of these computer games, you might never reach certain parts of the map. I don't know if you've had the experience of reading Choose Your Own Adventure books. These are books written for children where you get a couple pages of text and then you can decide if you want to go in the room, you turn to this page. If you want to stay in the room you're in and open the box, go to this other page. Part of the experience of aporia is the experience of failure, that you never reach the end of the narrative. I never made it through any of these books. And all the times I tried, I always ended up dying and had to put the book down. But that is an essential part of how these texts work, is that the author or composer, now we're gradually transitioning into talking about scores, can be actively involved in thwarting your efforts to achieve a sort of literary or artistic transcendence. And that distinguishes them from normally bound books or normally notated scores where all of the material is always available to you all the time. So I wanted to use this as an apparatus to analyze the scores that I think have been fairly difficult for us to analyze up until now. And as part of that analysis, I developed a few criteria to describe how the scores work. I'm not going to go too much into detail about how these work, but these are questions I think are important to ask about these scores to describe how they function. So questions of whether, for example, if you are producing material in the course of your realization, if that material is retained. A really good example of that is the piece Plus Minus from Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Mary Bauermeister. He instructs you as part of the score that as you work through permutations of material, that when you get to the end of that working through, that you should notify the publisher what the final states were of all these different parameters. I talked to Universal Edition about that score and asked if anybody had ever let them know. what their end states were. They said, no one's ever called us about that. So if you would like to be the first to do a complete realization, please notify the publisher. I'm sure they will be very happy to know what the end states are of your particular process. How the score and its realization interact with the physical space in which it takes place, the question of the proscenium. Some of these pieces are staged on a conventional stage, some of them exist as an environment, some of them are halfway in between, some of them allow interaction from the audience. Who generates the score materials, whether if you are yourself being asked to write materials. For example, Cornelius Cardew's treatise has a couple musical staves at the bottom where you are asked to write in normal notation that you actually read. How the score is physically constructed, whether the pages are bound or not, that is a significant factor, as I'm going to talk about with Habenstock-Hamadi's Decision and Constellation. And even though he is using the exact same material to print both of those scores, they function very differently just because one is bound and the other is unbound. Whether the marks on the page refer to identifiable musical behaviors or events, that's also an important question. Some of these scores, they work, at least on the micro level, as if they were notated. There is a relationship between marks that you see and some identifiable sound, sometimes not. Whether those materials are in the process of a realization, whether they're altered. For example, in John Cage's Variations 3, you were asked to cut up a transparent sheet and drop that onto the floor to create the score. That is part of the process of realizing the piece. And lastly, the question of access. That is the question of how much you know about what other participants in this realization know. There are certain scores where, for example, it can be projected up on the wall. That's one of the interesting things about Constellationen, is that when it was first published, you could buy it as a set of slides, and you could project that onto a projection surface, and so everybody can see the same page. But there are other scores, I'm thinking like Alvin Lucier's City Memory Space, where you go out and make field recordings and then make notations of those field recordings, and you bring that and play it, so that when you're playing in an ensemble, you don't know what the other person can see, and you don't know what the source of that material is. You have to make educated guesses. As I go through this analysis, I'm going to give a brief analytical example. One last thing I want to make clear about Arthseth's terminology that I want to bring into talking about these scores is that he does not refer to the conventional roles of like author and reader. Those terms have sociological meaning that implies certain relationships between the participants, and I want to avoid that as well. So he refers to the process, and I'm going to refer to the process of realizing a score as an intrigue. We were talking about puzzle canons in the previous presentation, and it's the same sort of idea. It's not a musical work, or it's not a performance so much as it's an intrigue to solve. And because of that, he also refers to the person who creates the intrigue as the intrigant. The person to whom the intrigue is posed, who accepts it, is the intrigues, which may also be a group of people, may also include the intrigant, may also involve machine intelligences, may also involve other parties. So I want to be clear about the vocabulary I'm using here, just to avoid the idea of like a composer, performer, and audience member. Those have specific meanings to us that imply certain relations that I want to avoid. So I want to talk about Logothetis' Anastasis. This is a gallery presentation I and a few of my colleagues organized in 2005. Anastasis is here on the back wall. Here it is a little bit larger. I want to talk about the two sheets of the score that are on the right and the left. The center column here is a love poem that he wrote in the late 1950s that forms the sort of scaffold for the score. You can see from that, Logothetis had a very strong influence from concrete poetry. He was active in that scene that was in Vienna in the 1950s. But I want to leave that aside. On the two pages on the right and the left, here they are a little bit larger, you can see the musical figures that he has drawn on these two pages are a 180-degree rotation of one another. So it's the same general shape. But if you get a little closer to it, you will note, as we'll see in a couple slides, they're not exactly the same. And how that difference between these two versions of these figures plays out in the intrigue, I want to talk about in a little bit more detail. He gives you a little bit of instruction for how you should approach it. He has a set of performance instructions in the form of a 2-channel audio recording that's arguing with itself. Anastasis was originally a radio play, by the way, I should mention. And so the instructions themselves become part of the play. What he describes in this block of text on the left, I will translate, he says, the ways do not go only alongside one another or out away from one another, but also into another. And in this crossing with the other arises, grows the I, recognizes itself through the other, in the other, out of the other, at the other. A little later on in his instructions, he talks about, here on the right, he says, Gestaltungsbetrieb, I assume, means something like the enterprise of the arts. The enterprise of the arts does not only satisfy itself with pleasing forms, it drives our consciousness often into play labyrinths in the promise to find ourselves in this once again, to alleviate our, I love this German word, unsere Selbstsuche Sehnsucht, the longing to search for the self. And in the impossible, to discover the limits of one's own possibilities. So from these two fragments of the performance instructions, there's a strong implication that you're going to be approaching this score in terms of how parts of it cross with one another. And he implies that in that crossing, this idea of seeing oneself in the other is a significant part of the experience. He gives you a little bit of instructions for how you might interpret the visual information, these marks on the page. They're fairly conventional, the idea that size indicates volume. That has implications for how you would represent crescendi. The filling in or not of each of the various shapes can describe the tone color. He describes a little bit how agitated or how smooth the lines are would imply things like tremolos, or whether it's a very overtone-rich sound. But what's interesting about how that all works in aggregate is when you compare these two figures. This is now zoomed in on these two musical figures from a couple slides ago. When you look at them in detail, if you know how he notates pitch, in these two figures have all the same pitch classes altogether. But if you compare the shapes of them and their connection to one another, and the way that some of these pitches are represented, there's quite a lot of difference. Just for example, in the connection here, how these lines are very smooth, whereas here they're very agitated. It's entirely possible, and I think even likely, that if you were hearing these two figures alongside one another, it would be very difficult to tell that you were hearing the same figure, the same musical events. But the musicians know. From the visual appearance of these two figures, the performers on these two pages will know that they are playing two different variations of the same material. And that knowledge that they have is going to affect how they think about it. And I think that's the significant part about playing Anastasis. There are parts within the score, depending on how the score is arranged, you see it opens up in this sort of cross shape. It's bound in a special way so that certain pages are visible only in combination with certain others. As you are playing through the score, you will know, just because of how the score works, that other members of your group are going to be looking at certain other pages as you work through them, and you will know what they can see. And knowing that, you will expect that there will be some sort of crossing over between your material, even though that might not be audible in the acoustic surface. One other thing that I want to talk about here that I think will bring us into talking about Karma Dhamma Drama is that the visual appearance of these lines that you have here, and even as that applies to shapes, has a very real effect on how the pitches sound in performance. And this is part of, when we look at Karma Dhamma Drama, becomes much more present in how you understand the piece. Karma Dhamma Drama is a set of 7 one-act music theater pieces. This is a stage diagram from one of them. What he describes here in talking about the piece, their realization and their course unfolds only on stage during the performance and provides an insight into the becoming of the events, their forms, and also their conclusions, which from performance to performance might occur differently. That is the one aspect under which music and action can be so combined in one another, linked within one another, that they can mutually condition one another and from one another result. The way this works with Karma Dhamma Dhamma, he was much more explicitly concerned with ideas of cybernetics and feedback. These are sketches that are given to a dancer, and she is instructed to paint them in real time on the stage. And as she's painting them, the musicians are told to perform those figures as they are painted. That creates a very tangible feedback situation where, depending on how the musicians play, that will affect how the dancer is moving. How she moves is going to affect how she draws all of these figures, and so it ends up being this mutually reinforcing process. One of the other scenes in that same set of one-act theater pieces, this is called Knotenschrift. That's a play on words for the word for notation, Notenschrift, and Knoten, which is knots. He has spanned a couple wash lines across the stage space. The dancer is instructed to hang bits of cloth and thread along these two washing lines, and the musicians are asked to play them as if it's a notation. As an added wrinkle here, the cloth and thread that she is using in the course of hanging these materials on these lines are from her own costume. And so as she goes through, she's gradually also disrobing herself. And that, in the original performances, when I was talking to the composer's daughter, Yulia, she said, yeah, a few of these performances, the police came in and broke it up. It was still quite scandalous at the time. But depending on how the musicians are reacting to her behavior on stage, that will then, and presumably also the audience, that will affect how the dancer is behaving. One last part of how Karma Dhamma Dhamma works that I think is interesting to talk about is the explicitly sociological aspect of how he arranges some of these performance events. This is from the section called Revolt. The conductor has been given one set of cards, that's the group on the left. The musicians are given a second set of cards, that's the group on the right. Logothetis talks about how, even in the late 1960s, he felt that the market capitalist system, even in the arts, had reached such a point that it was no longer a system where input would be correlated with output. That is, the effort you put into an economic system no longer provided you any sort of guarantee of success, and it was much more of a card game. And so he wanted to create a system that, in the performance, that would critically reflect on that process. And so what we have in the course of Revolt is the conductor draws a set of cards that give instructions that he should be giving to the musicians. The musicians, in turn, have a set of cards that are instructing them whether or not they should follow what the conductor is doing or not, and in what order, or whether they should do other things that conflict with what the conductor is asking them to do. What I think is interesting about all of these processes is that in creating these sorts of situations, he's also breaking down the hierarchies that normally exist between a conductor and the musicians, and setting up the piece itself in its mechanical organization in a way that criticizes the conditions around which the piece was produced. I want to take that as a means to start talking about Constellationen from Habenstock Hamadi, because with his scores, there's much more clearly a flattened hierarchy between him as a composer and the musicians with whom he worked. Logothetis is very insistent on his role as the composer, as someone who determines the musical events. Habenstock Hamadi tended to be a lot more restrained. And you can see that in the design of the score. It's much more abstract. There's no specific pitch that's indicated. This is another page from the set of Constellationen. And with these, there is much less information specifically from the composer about how any individual part of this score should sound. And so in describing it with these, I was talking much more about how the events unfolded in their performance. There's a certain performance history from people who worked with Habenstock Hamadi, who then worked with others. So there's a certain genealogy in the performance practice. There is some visual influence that I think is useful to talk about with Habenstock Hamadi. You see in the design of his scores an influence from the suprematists who came to Europe through constructivism in the late 1930s. There's also a very strong influence from Alexander Calder. And so thinking about both of those artistic movements tends to affect how you think about the performances. He does provide some performance instructions. This is one of the few cases where he gives you some written information about how you might interpret the visual information. I'm not going to read all this, by the way. It's a very long block of text. But he talks about ways you could interpret the visual material of the score, but you also don't have to. You could read it from left to right if you want, but you could also read it in some other direction. What I think is interesting about this, though, is he does mention at a couple points in the text that his role as a graphic designer is partially him also thinking about how he might guide your eye through the score. He might design certain shapes, he might design certain arrangements of materials in such a way that he could anticipate where you might go next in looking at the score, which I think relates a little bit to how game designers think in anticipating how somebody might use the materials itself. As part of studying these scores, and particularly with Constellationen, there was a certain performance history to them. There was a performance in, I think, 2011 that Uli Fussenegger organized in Semper Depot. A few years later, in a workshop in 2014, there is a performance that's available on YouTube. This is a screen capture from a performance by Ljubinka Kulisic, who did a workshop with Uli Fussenegger as well. What I think is interesting about this performance from Ljubinka Kulisic is if you look in the back in this corner, she has projected one screen from the score up onto the wall so that the audience can also see it. And this is part of the idea of thinking of a score not only as something you put on your music stand, but as part of the visual environment as well. In analyzing these scores, I bring this up and compare these two performances because when I was analyzing how these scores worked, depending on which performance I'm talking about, there's a difference between how I describe the stage arrangement and how I describe the access that the different participants had in looking at the score. So this is, for musicologists, one of the really important parts about describing these kinds of scores is you have to talk about a concrete performance. You can't talk about how the score might work in the abstract because it can turn out very differently depending on what choices the participants made. And lastly, like I said, there is a very strong distinction between these two scores just because of how they are bound. In the case of Décision, you only have certain pairs of pages that are alongside one another. That's the idea of that score, is that every time you turn a page, you make a decision about whether you're playing the right or the left of that score, whereas with Constellationen, they're loosely organized, and so you can resort them. We're running out of time, so I will wrap up. There is some comparison you can make in talking about groups of scores that is useful, but I don't want to get too deeply into the statistics behind it. It also affects how you talk about the history of these scores. This is Mary Bauermeister's Kontra-Festival in Cologne in 1960. That is a more complex thing than simply the performances she organized in her studio. That was part of a complex interaction of different actors and interest groups. But lastly, the reason I want to talk about these kinds of scores is that as part of that process of their history coming to an end, the people who were involved in these scores found themselves, by the end of the 1960s, in a sort of enclave. The general idea of musical pluralism, where everything was acceptable, but everything is also kind of equally unimportant, meant that while these kinds of scores were tolerated, they never really were treated as like the forefront of musical developments like they were in the mid-1960s. But there are still people active in producing these scores. This was a performance in Stuttgart a few years ago involving a feedback loop between singers and plants, mutually respirating oxygen and carbon dioxide, which affects how the two of them, how the singers sing. There are collaboratively written operas where the people tasked with performing them are partially writing the libretto. And lastly, if I'm going to take myself seriously as a musicologist and say this is a meaningful part of talking about musical developments, it's also for me a meaningful part for how I compose. So these are a few of the scores that I've also produce myself. This is a performance in Stuttgart from a couple years ago with the Neue Vokalso list and with these little boxes with scores inside them. What I want to say with all of that is that the end of any given process, and in this case I talk about the end of the avant-garde, for me isn't really an end. This is the last hexagram from the I Ching, which translates in its meaning to not yet completed. It was felt that the end of the cycle can't really be the end, but is also the place where something new begins. And it's my hope, by laying some theoretical foundation for this material, that it can then find its way. If you are interested, by the way, I have a book. Buy my merch. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this extremely fascinating presentation. Not only the